Hi guys, Buildzoid here with another R9 3... Okay, it is orange. It's GIMP being weird. Anyway, Buildzoid here with another PCB breakdown for you. This time, Powercolor's take on what an R9 390 should look like. So this is the R9 390 PCS Plus. And I am fully aware that these cards are old and irrelevant, but I kind of want to eventually get... Well, ideally I would want to cover every card ever made. So, you know, this one's gonna get done eventually. So, well, not every card ever made, but sort of the more modern ones, yes. So let's get on with this. First things first, we're gonna go over all the major VRMs on the card, and then we're gonna go into more detail about what they're actually made up of. So, up here we find the auxiliary rail. So that drives your memory controller on the GPU. So that goes to your GPU core. Then down here, we find the 0.95 volt rail, and I've actually talked to an ASUS engineer about what this one does, and that drives the display, sort of the display circuitry, and it also is a voltage supply for some of the internal PLLs of the GPU. So that also goes to the GPU core, and I'll talk about that rail a little bit more in detail later. Up over here, you find there's the memory VRM, and below that we have the V-Core VRM. So the memory VRM does all of the GDDR5 memory chips, and the V-Core VRM does all the bulk of the computational logic of the core. Well, all of it. So stream processors, ROPs, and all of that kind of thing. So that's done by your vCore VRM. So now let's take a look at these in more detail, starting with the most important one, which happens to be the biggest one, the vCore VRM. So zoom in a bit. And Powercolor opted for a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 phase design. So we do have 6 inductors, and we do have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 power stages. So these right here are International Rectifier 3556s, the bigger brothers of the 3553 and the smaller, sort of weaker version of the 3555. And I am fully aware of how bizarre that numbering scheme is, but this is what International Rectifier opted for. So these are a 40 amp part, and we saw those on the R9 390 Nitro, card. So you can watch that if you want to. Yeah, you can go watch that if you want more details. The IR3556, that's a 50 amp part, and that is a 60 amp part. So this VRM right here, having 6 of the 3556s, is capable of doing 300 amps continuous at 125 degrees centigrade, which is perfectly acceptable for an R9 390. It's not the most powerful VRM on an R9 390 ever, but it is enough. It is plenty even for LN2 usage, so no real complaints from me there. As for the phase count, well, the VRM is driven by this right here, which is the IR3567B, and that's a 6+2 phase voltage controller. So that 6 goes straight to the V-Core. There's no doublers anywhere on the PCB, so this is a true 6-phase VRM design. So good job, Powercolor. This is actually a really nice VRM we have here. So now let's move on to the memory VRM. The memory VRM is not using International Rectifier power stages. It instead uses on-semiconductor discrete MOSFETs. So you have 2 low side FETs there and 2 high side FETs. The low side FETs are... so these guys are NT... and I hate this model number, MFS 4983s. Okay? And that's with NF at the end again. But if you just Google that and on semiconductor, you will get these if you want the data sheet. So those are 4983s from On Semiconductor, and these are everything else the same, 4955 4955. So you just substitute the 4983 with 4955. This combination of MOSFETs is good for about, let me check my notes, 46 amps, continuous at 125 degrees, assuming a 500 kilohertz switching frequency. And I'm running out of space to write in again, so let's move that over. So your memory gets 46 amps, that's not a 6. 46 amps, 125 degrees. 500 kilohertz switching frequency, assuming 1.6 volts. And for lower temperatures, like something that the VRM would actually run at, say 100 degrees, you can expect the VRM to deliver 84 amps of current. So a lot more power if you keep this VRM cool. Nothing really worth complaining about. This voltage is not accessible through software. It is actually it should theoretically be super easy to hard mod on this card because it uses one of those really basic 8-pin voltage controllers for the memory VRM, which are very, very easy to volt mod, even in terms of soldering. The only issue is I actually have no idea what voltage controller it is because I can't read the model number from the photo of the back of the PCB. So we're not going to go over how to mod that, but yeah, basically, if you keep this VRM cool, you should be able to push, say, 1.85 volts into the memory, though the results of whether or not that'll let the memory clock higher will vary. So, yeah, and definitely, if you're going to be pushing more voltage into the memory, you should already have the core maxed out, as the Hawaii chips with their 512-bit bus tend to not get memory bottlenecked very much. So really that would be sort of the very last thing you would want to do. Like if you're overclocking the card for, say, Firestrike or something on LN2, that would be very, very much the last thing you would be tweaking. So core first on these. Moving over back to this side, the auxiliary rail, that is again an IR3556. So we get 50 amps for the auxiliary rail, which is plenty. Since this is a minor VRM, it really doesn't need to deliver that much power. And this, I have no idea what it is. That chip right there. I have no idea what that is for the 0.95 volt rail. I wish I did know, but this doesn't come up with anything. And the 0.95 volt rail, so I've said this in a bunch of other AMD GPU PCB breakdowns, but I'll say it again. This rail is, so this powers your display circuit, so your display drive, so what actually sort of processes the image before it goes to your display outputs. And it also powers some internal PLLs. This VRM is very, very useful to volt mod if you're going on LN2, because AMD GPUs have a tendency of losing display outputs at around sort of below minus 80C. Minus 70C and below, you start losing display outputs on a lot of AMD cards. And the way to get around that is to tweak this voltage up. So you need a hard mod for that because very few GPUs allow you to control this voltage via software. I think maybe the MSI R9 290X Lightning supports software voltage control on this rail, but every other GPU you need to hard mod it. And so if you hard mod this one, you want to tweak it sort of into the 1 volt to 1.1 volts range. If you push it much further than that, you get really, really close to very quickly killing the card. Regardless of what kind of cooling you have, the circuits that this powers just can't take a lot of voltage. And they're also, so they're very, very sensitive. And past sort of 1.2 volts, cards start losing their display outputs completely, like the circuit just dies. And if you do that, well, the card is completely useless. So, yeah. Very much a LN2 only VRM that you really shouldn't worry about unless you're running LN2. And even if you're running LN2, you can actually run without modding this. You just have to, well, have a bit more faith in the computer to finish the benchmark while the screen is black, because you're going from like, when you go from like desktop to load, the image will drop out. It'll just black screen. It doesn't mean the card's actually not running. It's still running and you just can't see anything happening, which is, you know, less than ideal, but this is hard to mod and one of the more dangerous voltages to tweak on a AMD GPU. So, yeah, that. So that pretty much covers it. Oh wait, one thing I forgot to point out, there's a BIOS switch up here, so the card does have dual BIOS functionality. What else? That does cover it at this point. So overall, I'd say Powercolor did a good job on this PCB. There's nothing I would super complain about. Actually, there's not really anything at all I would complain about, except maybe the memory VRM. I mean, running it 125 degrees is really like, that's where most VRMs are like, that's like the absolute maximum of where you want your VRM to get to, but I'd appreciate maybe a couple more amps at that temperature. Admittedly, if I tweak the switching frequency, because I'm assuming that 500 kilohertz switching frequency, I'm not actually sure because I can't figure out what voltage controller this card uses for the memory VRM, but I'm assuming 500 kilohertz. At 300 kilohertz, the rating goes up significantly, so yeah. So the memory VRM is really the only thing I would say could be better. Everything else, as far as I'm concerned, is fine. Well, VCore could also be better, but then again, at some point it sort of starts not being worth the extra cost. And really, it is extra cost because interesting thing about this mount right here is that if you see this solder down here that's coming off, so that's because the all of these, the 3555, the 3556, 3553, they all share the exact same mounting points. So theoretically, if you had this card, you could totally go buy a bunch of 3555s, desolder all of these, and swap in the 3555s, and it should work because they are pin compatible, and these pads are, like, these are solder pads for the bigger 3555s. So also you could downgrade to 3553s if you wanted to, so that's kind of cool. But yeah, that's really just a case of like Powercolor could have opted for those, but that would have obviously raised the cost of the PCB quite a lot, because that is 6 MOSFETs, and well, 7, because if you're buying 6 MOSFETs for VCore, it doesn't make sense to buy a different one for your auxiliary, so at that point you're buying 7 upgraded FETs, and that's why generally you'll see, you know, sort of downcosted, well, cheaper options used instead of the absolute best. So that's that for this video. I hope you liked it. If you did, there's a like button. There's also a comment section where you can criticize anything you want to or ask questions. You should subscribe if you haven't. Subscribe if you haven't already. If you have subscribed, there's also that bell thing. You can, you know, sign up to notifications. And is that it? I think that's it. Oh, wait, right, I keep forgetting the Patreon. I do have a Patreon, so if you would like to help out with actually hardcore overclocking, you could go, you know, donate to my Patreon. And that's that for this video. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.